Good morning. Welcome to the 30th meeting of this year of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off mobile phones and Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. We have apologies today from Rob Gibson, Angus MacDonald and Alex Ferguson. I welcome Jimmy McGregor, who will substitute for Alex, and Roderick Campbell, who will substitute for Angus. As Rob Gibson isn't present, I shall convene the meeting today. Agenda item 1 is the draft budget scrutiny. 2014-2015. We will hear from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Paul Wheelhouse. Good morning and welcome, Minister. And his officials, Dr Bob McIntosh, Director for Environment and Forestry, Bob Irvin, the Deputy Director for Climate Change and Water Industry, Scottish Government, and Neil Ritchie, Head of Natural Assets and Flooding, Scottish Government. I think we'll just get straight to the question, if that's okay, Minister.
Would it be appropriate just to make a few opening comments?
You're very welcome if that's what you want to do.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this year's budget decisions with the committee, and I would like to make some very brief opening remarks, if I may. The committee is taking considerable interest, obviously, in a number of issues which I consider to be priorities for the Scottish Government, and you've already taken considerable time this year looking at RPP2, for which I'm grateful. And I've identified your interest in climate change adaptation, flood risk management and the biodiversity strategy, among other matters. These are important issues for the Rural Affairs and Environment portfolio and for the wider Scottish Government, and they feature heavily in my programme of work and that of the Scottish Government. Now, particularly through the work of our public bodies such as Scottish Environment Protection Agency, Forestry Commission Scotland and Scottish Natural Heritage, we are providing leadership. And the committee heard last week from David Peary, SEPA's Director of SIDES, about the work that has been done to produce Scotland's first ever national flood risk assessment and how this is being used to drive local flood risk strategies. These will help prioritise resources and drive real reductions in flood risk, benefiting many of our communities and businesses. The collective work of SEPA, Scottish Water, local authorities and other stakeholders is a classic example of effective public service delivery. In doing so, we are working closely with and supported by other portfolios. Delivery of our RPP2 ambitions is one where I have the support of my ministerial colleagues. Across the Scottish Government, we understand the collective challenge of meeting our climate change targets. And last year I outlined my intention to engage closely with other portfolios to ensure that we identify opportunities for collective action. This has helped in the development of RPP2, and I am committed to continuing it as we act to deliver against our commitments. I'm particularly appreciative of the support of ministerial colleagues in increasing investment in low-carbon investment to just under £1.3 billion over the period to 2015-16. However, I do not wish to see the delivery of the Scottish Government ambitions around the environment to be a matter solely for the public sector. I'm keen that we promote actions that protect and promote the environment, and where appropriate this requires legislation, and I appreciate that the committee has spent time this year looking at our work on better environmental regulation. However, it is also about supporting and encouraging the actions of individuals and communities, and the committee will be aware of changes that we have made to the Climate Challenge Fund to help maximise its potential and to ensure it fulfils our ambition to support communities to achieve the transition to a low-carbon future. So thank you for the opportunity just to make those brief opening remarks, Deputy Convener. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. I'll kick off. Many of the indicators in the National Performance Framework of relevance to the Rural Affairs and Environment portfolio are deemed to be worsening. Could you tell us how the performance of key indicators was taken into account when determining the nature of the draft budget?
Well, it's an important point. I mean, it's something that I'm acutely aware of, that particularly in areas such as terrestrial birds, we have a continuing negative position where for the last few years there has been a decline in that index, which is of concern to ministers. And so issues like that feed into our thinking in terms of redesigning the SRDP. So specifically looking at how we can target the support of the SRDP more effectively to ensure that we tackle the kinds of issues that we're facing in terms of challenges with the National Performance Framework indicators. There is an increase in approach in terms of additional funding for air quality, for example, another one where we're conscious that there are issues in terms of air quality management areas and the increasing number of those. Obviously, in regard to RPP2, one of our key indicators is excuse me, the carbon footprint of Scotland, which we're satisfied with making good progress on delivery in respect of our production emissions, those emissions produced in Scotland. But clearly we also have to take account of our impact in terms of our carbon footprint globally. And so a lot of the work we're doing through the behavioural framework that you are looking at as a committee in regards to RPP2 will hopefully help steer consumption patterns in Scotland to help reduce the consumption of products which are, by their nature, produced in a way that generates a lot of emissions. So there are a number of themes there, but clearly we're very sensitive to the issue that we have had poor figures in terms of terrestrial birds. It's a complex picture. It's not all species of birds. There are some that are in recovery, but we do have a particular challenge with upland birds, and so therefore the kind of investment we're making through SRDP in areas like peatland restoration should feed through into benefits in terms of biodiversity and therefore help with some of these indicators.
Claudia Beamish wants to develop this point.
Thank you, Deputy Convener, and good morning, Minister. After, may I say, the very positive climate change conference yesterday, which is an exciting step forward. In terms of the National Performance Framework, I'm very keen, and I don't know if you would agree with me, to see that threading through Scotland's future, whatever government and whatever form of constitution we have in the future exists. And I'm wondering more specifically if you can help us with how that direct link can be reinforced between the National Performance Framework and the budget. You've highlighted one or two things that are worsening and indeed things that are improving, which I hope doesn't mean to say that budgets in future would therefore go down because of that. But I'm just looking at the information here. You've highlighted the terrestrial birds, but in terms of the responsibilities of SNH and the national parks, increasing people's use of Scotland's outdoors is not improving. And I see that there is a concern more specifically that SNH shows a 4% fall in cash terms and a 5.8% fall in real terms, and national parks a 12.2% fall in cash terms and 13.9% fall in real terms. So really the question is, when there are specific issues, how do you address that within an annual budget, but also more broadly about how the connection can be made more robust?
Well, you're absolutely right, Chloe Beamish, just to raise those points. I mean, in regards to outdoor activity, the proportion of the population making use of the outdoors did decline in 2012. I would hope that we'll see quite a strong bounce back in the 2013 figures. The reason why I say that is we had particularly bad weather in terms of summer in 2012. It was very wet, there was a lot of rainfall, which obviously had implications in flood risk terms. And therefore, if you like, the attractiveness for many people going out to enjoy the countryside was reduced. We also had the Olympics, which probably meant that a lot of people were staycationing, but staycationing even in their own homes watching the Olympics, so they may have had an impact there. I think we'll know if there is a downward trend, we would see it in 2013, but I suspect that we'll see quite a strong rebound with the very good weather we've had this summer. But that shows, like many indicators when it comes to RPP2 and our meeting our climate change targets, how vulnerable we are in terms of some of our targets to fluctuations and things like the weather. So we have to try and make ourselves more resilient in achieving these targets. And clearly the work we do through SNH and others will help support that in the national parks. In regards
that point,
sorry, I'm just going to come on to the budget issues, but yes.
Sorry.
Just in terms of the national parks, it's true to say that the overall budget for grant and aid funding for national parks is going down by about 12%, or 1.8 million reduction between 13-14 and 14-15. But it is a complex picture. We had in 13-14 we had used shovel-ready money for the, I don't particularly like the phrase, but we had used shovel-ready money to support the national parks in that year, and that meant there was an extra 1.8 million in the capital line in 13-14. So that is responsible for, if that wasn't in there, we'd actually have had an increase in capital. As it happens, we've got a 57% decrease in capital in the capital line in 14-15. What I would say is we'd take a similar approach if we do find ourselves in a position where we do have access to funding at the end of year, or capital funding becomes available during the year, we would again be looking to see if there are opportunities to invest in our national parks. So, and indeed, I've primed both Grant Moyer and Fiona Logan to think about projects that they could have ready if we are in that position to do so. So it will be a constant case of seeing if there are opportunities to invest in, as we have done in long-distance trails and on visitor facilities in the national parks, to encourage more people to go out and use them, because they are tremendous assets for the nation. When it comes to SNH, there is a small decrease of the order of 4% in the budget line. You're quite correct in that. That was announced in last year's budget, and it's just been carried forward in terms of the, if you like, it's one of the areas of the portfolio that has taken the proportionate reduction in budget that we're seeing across Scottish Government, and I'm confident that SNH are already planning on that basis and can cope with that reduction, albeit I wouldn't be choosing to do that if we didn't have to. So I hope that gives you a bit of context, but certainly the National Parks figures are indeed slightly misleading, and we had a very large allocation through shovel-ready money last year, which is responsible for the apparent decline in their budget. But taking that out, there's only a 0.2 million drop in the resource budget, or 2% for the national parks.
So, Minister, could you help me further with any thoughts on making the links between the budget and national performance framework more robust, not for this year but for the future, in terms of future planning? I
think it's a fair point, and when I was in the Finance Committee, I was making similar sort of comments myself about the need to sort of reflect national performance framework and the budget. And indeed, I think that's the intention. I mean, clearly we've had what I feel is a good degree of support from Mr Swinney and colleagues in terms of delivering additional investment in RPP2 terms to help us fulfil our commitments, recognising that so far the EU has not moved to a higher level of ambition, and that we may need to fall back on more domestic action. So we're accelerating investment where we can, and I think my intent would be to continue that dialogue and see if we can encourage ministers to look for similar opportunities going forward. But that is obviously linked to some of our key national performance framework measures. On the terrestrial birds, absolutely, and it's certainly something that's feeding through into our thinking about designing SRDP, about how we achieve better in future targeting of those resources to help with our biodiversity indicators. And to go in terms of yesterday's discussion with the Climate Justice Conference, to move beyond simply GDP and look at other measures of the well-being of Scotland, and I think these are important ones to take on board.
Thank you. Nigel Dawn has a question.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just say, and extending precisely that point, I think it would be generally recognised that a significant amount of exercise is actually the best protector against heart disease. Therefore, I do just wonder, in very general terms, to what extent you can get the health and well-being budget shifted towards actually getting people into the outdoors, because it'll help them.
Well, there's a very good point Mr Don makes. I mean, we certainly, through our investment through Wyatt, the woodlands in and around towns, are working closely with colleagues like Michael Matheson to sort of understand the impact it can have in terms of preventative spend on improving our health, our nation's health. Recently visited Larbert Hospital, the Forth Valley Hospital in Larbert. We saw a very impressive network of paths that have been put in through partnership between Forestry Commission Scotland and the NHS board, and indeed other partners like the Falkirk Council, who've worked together to create a network of paths around the hospital using the grounds there, but for the benefit of patients, but also for the wider community who are able to use that path network, which is very attractive woodland and former policies from a stately home that was in that area. So I think we can look for these opportunities, and certainly the wider National Forest Estate is very important, as you know, for tourism and recreation, and is a good example of how we can deliver wider ecosystem services and benefits to the public from our natural resources.
Thank you. Moving on to the subject of flooding, and Jim Hume will lead on that. Yes,
thank you very much, Convener, and morning, everyone. Just regarding flooding, you mentioned the flood risk of back in 2012, and we've luckily had a good summer to put that into the distant memory, but it's always never far away. Last week at committee we had Aberdeenshire Council in front of us giving evidence, and they said there was a a need for improvements regarding accuracy of flood forecasting. Therefore, I wondered what work the government's doing to improve the accuracy of flood forecasting in Scotland, how this will be funded, and when would more accurate flood forecasts be available for the likes of councils and maybe other stakeholders?
Well, clearly I share your concerns that just because we've had a good summer, I mean, I do fear that given what we know about the recent IPCC report and the likely implications for our climate, which we're still evaluating the messages that are coming out of there, that we do, it would appear, feel confident in saying we're going to have more erratic weather going forward, and therefore these kind of rapid, intense precipitation events that preceded some of the floods we had last year are likely to be a more regular feature of our society going forward. So it's a key part of our adaptation programme that we're looking to make sure that we are resilient to severe weather, and flooding is a key part of that flood risk management. In terms of the work we're doing on the flood warning side of things, on 28th of January this year, SEPA launched 28 new coastal flood warning schemes, which would help in relation to giving an improved alert facility for those authorities that are in areas like Aberdeenshire, both in terms of the north and east coast of Aberdeenshire, to give them more protection in future and more warning of when flood incidents may occur. And that's covering, effectively, we've also got coverage of the Forth and Tay coastal areas as well. There is, I'm conscious, a desire to improve the flood warning protection in the Murray Firth area more generally, to get a stronger level of availability of information there in the Murray Firth. It is a priority in terms of the funding that's been identified for SEPA and other partners in terms of addressing flooding. We have a rise in the budget for pollution and flooding under the current draft budget of increased from 1 million to 3.99 million, and that provides funding to address specific pressures on water environment particularly, but covers flood risk objectives, so it's covering issues like diffuse pollution as well, but it is the headline budget, if you like, that covers our investment in flood risk objectives more generally. And I was looking at whether Neil Ritchie, if I may, convener, just bring in Neil Ritchie just to discuss what we're doing specifically on flood risk warnings.
Yeah, just maybe helpful just to remind the committee that in December last year, SEPA published its flood warning strategy for the period up to 2016, which highlights how they are going to be rolling out further improvements to the existing flood warning service across Scotland, and that particularly includes a number of coastal-related schemes, because historically we've been very good at getting the river coverage, which was the main priority. Now we've done that work, it's moving on to cover coastal. We're shortly launching the Stonehaven flood warning scheme, which will give information, particularly to that local community, and that's something we've been able to do in the light of the recent flooding events in that community. In addition, I'd also highlight the work that's not visibly in the public domain around the joint SEPA Met Office Scottish Flood Forecasting Service, which provides a daily readout of flood risk over a 5-day period to local authorities and other emergency responders, to allow them to actually get their planning work in place, identify what's coming along, and take appropriate action. And that is something that we're continually reviewing and revising in terms of actually how the detail of that information is provided. And a key challenge at the moment, and it's a very technical one which SEPA are working forward with key agencies, is how we can actually better refine that information so it's actually more targeted. And that is something, once we've cracked there, we'll be able to roll out in terms of precise targeting of information for the public through the floodline warning system.
May convener just refer to a couple of points as well. It's worth stating that I think Mr Hume raised the issue about the accuracy of the information, and although I'm not saying this necessarily applies in every case, so I don't want to be complacent about it, when I discussed the recent flood, it's almost a year ago now, I suppose. It's just after I took the post with East Lothian Council following a flood in Haddington. about their perceptions as to the kind of quality of the service. They had been told that morning that the likelihood of a flood would be, I think from memory, about 1:30 in the afternoon. They were accurate to 1 minute, 1 minute out. So it was quite a decent result. I mean, and they were able to prioritise the resources to be there in time to minimise the ultimate flood. That it did affect a couple of businesses in Haddington, but they were able to take the edge off that flood and make sure that more properties weren't affected. So I think Ray Montgomery, East Lothian Council, was very complimentary about the accuracy of the prediction in that case. Now, I'm not saying that is in every case, but it does show that the model can work. And I suppose it's always the case that the clock is always right. Even a broken clock could be right twice a day. But I think that's just one example of the kind of messages I'm getting, that generally speaking the modelling is quite accurate and gives people a pretty accurate view as to when the flood risk will be at its maximum and when to get the resources in place. The other thing I would say is just in a specific example, because Aberdeenshire was mentioned, that we hopefully will have in place a flood warning scheme for Stonehaven soon, so that will hopefully help give a greater degree of information to that community, which obviously I was saddened to see affected by a very severe 2 floods in December last year. So we are working on a case-by-case basis and trying to improve the level of service we have at local level. Just to put in perspective, I think I mentioned a figure earlier on of the line that specifically relates to that might cover flooding, but more generally natural assets and flooding budgets, up 3.7 million, or a 70% increase between 13-14 and 14-15. So in terms of resourcing this kind of area, we are in a much better position than in the current year that we're in.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. Given that we're on the subject of Stonehaven and Aberdeenshire, it won't surprise the Minister to know that Nigel Dawn has a contribution to make.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Minister. It is surprising, perhaps, how often Stonehaven does seem to come up in the context. I think because what happened there was just so extraordinary and took quite a few people by surprise. I'm wondering, though, if I might just continue what you previously said about the flood in Haddington. My observation of what recently happened last year, of course, in Brechin, was that people knew the timing. It's just that, unfortunately, they didn't take the precautions early enough. So there were people standing there waiting for the water to come over, and when it came over, oh dear, where are the bags? But that, of course, is part of how people respond. Now, I think that's going to be my first question, which is, given that every time we ask about climate change, in the first sentence, people talk about floods or the risk of floods as one of the consequences, because we get these major downpours, more unpredictable, and seemingly cloudbursts seem to be bigger. I don't know whether that's an artifact of history and our observation of it. But given that that's always top of everybody's mind, what are you able to do to make sure that all the organisations, and there are several and there should be, are actually pulling together so that we get the maximum result for the budget? Because plainly this is a subject that isn't going to go away, and we really do need to make it work as well as we can.
I mean, it's an important point. I mean, there is, I think, an expectation in the part of many people in the community that the protection of their property is someone else's responsibility, the local authority or some other body. And the sad reality of it is that the legislation that currently stands is that it's an individual's personal responsibility to protect their property. And I saw myself when I went to Stonehaven to see your constituents, the obvious impact that it had, where maybe people were in low-income households, they hadn't made provision and couldn't afford perhaps to make provision. And we know, as we discussed, I think, in the Chamber, that 10% of people in Stonehaven did not have flood insurance for one reason or another, either affordability or had been refused flood insurance. So, so the very practical impact it had there, and very distressing to see people in such a sort of traumatic situation for them and their families. So I think, you know, that there is a need to try and tackle that sort of substantial and intractable problem. It would seem that there are always going to be some people at this moment in time who are not making provision for protecting themselves or their property. So we need to do a number of things. We haven't reached a conclusion in this, but we are having discussions with Scottish Flood Forum and others about how we tackle the specific issue about personal flood protection, and hope to, you know, if we can reach a conclusion on that, I hope to come back to committee with more information on that. We clearly are working with the insurance industry as a result of the proposed approach by the UK Government in terms of taking forward Flood Re as an insurance product with the industry to develop our own if you like, memorandum of understanding with the insurance industry to cover us for that interim period. So that will help ensure that properties are at least able to access flood insurance. But the more significant issue, I suppose, is about how we continue to go on forward and flood the major flood prevention schemes that are necessary in some communities. And at this moment in time, there is going to be a second round of applications in autumn 2013 under the current arrangements with COSLA. Timing still to be agreed by the panel themselves, and they will keep us informed of that. And further guidance will be issued building on the experience gained from round one, where there were some issues, as I think, Mr Don, you're aware, in terms of the allocation of funding. So for specific areas like Brecon, where I did visit at your request, and saw for myself the kind of impact it was having on that community, we are still in discussions with Angus Council about just confirming their scheme, making sure that it is compliant. There's a couple of things to be done, but we should be in a position shortly where that is confirmed, and then that will then go forward, and we will look sympathetically at the case for communities like Brecon in the next round, which will be, as I say, hopefully be announced in autumn this year.
Right. I'm grateful for that specific, to which I would, of course, have come. And the Minister will appreciate that actually communities are very grateful for all the warm words and sympathy. But as the Minister knows perfectly well from his own region, actually the only thing they care about is when the bricks and mortar or whatever it is actually there and they feel protected. I'm wondering if I could come back, please, to the issue of insurance for starters, because I'm hearing of folk who are struggling to get insurance. I'm also hearing of folk who say, well, actually, it's not worth my while taking any precautions because it doesn't even reduce the insurance premium. Surely that's something we need to be nudging.
It is a very valid point. I've raised that point myself with the ABI, the Association of British Insurers, just as to whether they could consider and come back to us with a view as to whether, if we do see investment by individuals in the same way as if you put in double mortise locks and various other things in your house, you get a reduction in your insurance premium. If people are taking all steps and it can be demonstrated the equipment was deployed at the time of a flood and they still had damage, would that be taken into account? And I think that is a genuine point that we have raised with the industry. I have yet to have feedback on that. We have also had more positive engagement with them about what we can do to make sure that communities where there has been some community level flood prevention scheme put in place or other measures deployed, that is taken into account in calculating community-wide the insurance premiums that individuals and consumers face. And we have had much more progress there. We've got agreement of all 32 local authorities in Scotland to be able to supply their data on a real-time basis to SEPA, who are coordinating this activity, to make sure that information is available to the industry, so the industry can see that since, say, whatever most recent flood risk assessment has been done, that there has been a subsequent investment and therefore the flood risk has been lowered. And we're updating our flood risk assessment at this time as well, and we'll have shortly updated flood risk maps with indicating the risk that's at a local level as well, which hopefully inform that discussion with the industry and make sure they take the most accurate data forward in calculating the risks to a community and to assets in that community.
Yeah, okay. Forgive me, Kevin, can I just, there's one other issue which is very top of quite a number of people's mind, and I'm sure it applies well across Scotland, not just in my area. And that is, we've talked about some of the things that people can do to protect themselves. I mean, literally gates across front doors if you happen to have solid walls all the way around. But as the Minister himself has alluded to, there are some people who just don't feel they have the funds to do that for whatever reason, and some of these things are quite expensive. When I put it to one of my local councils that they might provide a loan scheme to help people in this position, and that doesn't sound stupid because it's bound to reduce the local authorities' costs if something subsequently does flood, they came back saying, well, effectively, it would have to fit in with an existing idea of how a scheme might be. So I think they thought the minimum loan will probably have to be £5,000, but it certainly wouldn't be 500. And it would have to be on a property which was otherwise unsecured. In other words, a commercial loan, effectively. Now, I hope it's pretty obvious the moment I say that. That is absolute nonsense in the context of what we're talking about. It's practically never going to apply, and the sums apply aren't appropriate anyway. So I'm wondering whether you would be able, as Minister and through the government, to use your good offices to say, look, we actually need some other mechanism for letting people access, perhaps at sensible rates, but nonetheless without the paperwork, the kind of money that will enable them to put sensible floodgates or non-return valves into their sewage systems. The pretty elementary things, the air bricks, I mean, that's pretty much all you need to talk about, actually. Whether we can allow people who simply don't have access to the funds and the current economic circumstances may not have it for a while, to actually get the money to do that kind of stuff now. Because if I come back to the point that Jim Hume made earlier on, I mean, yes, the winter's on its way. I don't think we should even be thinking about winter in terms of flooding. This can happen at absolutely any time of the year. It might be just marginally more likely in winter. People need to be able to do these things. Therefore, they need to be able to fund them. Therefore, some of them need some help.
I should apologise, Commissioner, to the sound man if there's any roaring going on. It's just my stomach, I'm afraid. The equipment is absolutely fine. It's a very real point. I mean, as I sort of alluded to earlier on, but I didn't go into much detail. It's the kind of point we're discussing with the Flood Forum, because you're quite right, Mr. Don, that you know, it's unrealistic to expect individuals on low incomes to have the kind of awareness about how to go about getting a loan in the first place, but even if it was available at the kind of sums that were necessary. So we will need to probably take a different approach. I suppose there's a couple of things here. We know, fortunately, because we've got pioneering legislation in terms of the Flood Risk Management Act, we know where flood risks and potentially vulnerable areas are in Scotland. We know how many properties are potentially at risk. So we can then funnel down our effort onto those communities and areas potentially vulnerable areas. So we're not having to do anything that's indiscriminate across Scotland. We can then have a look at which areas and which schemes are likely to come forward in terms of major capital projects in discussion with COSLA. And those will reduce the flood risk in those areas quite dramatically in many cases. There will remain communities that, for reasons of timing, because it will take a while before a capital project is up and running, or because they're still doing consultation and the planning process, or indeed there may be communities for economic reasons where it's not going to be viable to have, or indeed attractive to have, a flood prevention scheme which would maybe totally alter the appearance of a community or its environment, to look at how we protect individual properties. So we may have to take a differentiated approach. And so in those circumstances, we can't have a situation, we can't tolerate a situation, I suppose, where you would have some people who are too poor to participate in that and others are able to afford it. I would cite there's some really good examples. I'm sure Mr Hume will be aware, and indeed Ms Beamish may be aware, in Scottish Borders Council provide this kind of equipment at cost, and they have done for many years, and it's a very successful scheme, so that I've taken advantage of it as well in my own office in Hoyk, that I've been able to get floodgates for the office at cost, and I think that's a great service that the Council do for the community. And there are local flood groups like the Hoyk Flood Management Group who do provide that function in advising members of the community, and I would encourage communities that are at risk of flooding to look at setting up a similar group so they can advise particularly the most vulnerable people in the community, the elderly, those who have infirmities and disabled, to make sure they are protected. And I will look very sympathetically at ideas about how we can deliver some form of funding to assist those individuals who cannot afford to do it. So it's one of the things we are in discussion with Scottish Flood Forum, and I do give an undertaking I'll come back to the committee once we're in a clearer position as to how we might go about that. The potential maybe is to use local social landlords or local authority as maybe the delivery mechanism, rather than providing individual funding or requiring people to apply for grants. We'd want to do something that which was, if we would go down that route, something which was easy to deliver and easy to monitor in terms of its efficacy. But it's a very valid point, and something to come back to the committee once we know more about that.
Grateful.
Before we move on, can I remind members to try and focus on the budget, strictly on that today, if we can. Moving on, Richard Lyle.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Convener. Morning, Minister. Within the natural asset and flooding budget line, there is a sum of £0.5 million in 2014-15 to address historic impacts in the water environment. Lisa Webb actually recently told the committee from RSPB, told the committee that compared to the cost of some projects, £0.05 million is a small sum and insignificant to address historic impacts in the water environment. So could you tell the committee which historic impacts on the water environment this budget line addresses, whether this sum is sufficient, Will there any other sources of funding that also can be used to address these impacts, please?
Well, it's an issue I'm aware that has been raised, and you're quite right, Mr. Lyle, that it's aimed to address historic issues. Now, some of those might be perhaps weirs that have been put in, sort of old weirs that are no longer used for industrial purposes, but are providing a barrier perhaps to fish be able to spawn further upstream. So we can either, in some cases, remove the weir in its entirety, if that's possible to do so, and there's maybe not any heritage kind of reasons for maintaining the weir for reasons to do with local heritage concerns, or to put in, alternatively, means by which fish can traverse those barriers. It's part of a wider programme to try and improve, obviously, the water quality in Scotland, where we have had progress, but we're at consistently around the low 60% in terms of the achievement of Water Framework Directive, and we want to push on and improve our performance in that area. So there is Water Framework Directive money that is picking up some of these historic impacts, and I saw an example of that when I went to visit sort of a project in Amman Valley, where there is a historic weir there. It's worth stating that that's only one half of the money. The SEPA also have about £500,000 in their budget. I believe I just checked with Neil Ritchie. That's correct, is it?
That's correct, for the Water Restoration Fund.
So they have Water Restoration Fund as well, and also there are other measures for land managers through SRDP and other routes to be able to do things like riparian planting and to contribute to the improvement of water environment. And I had the great pleasure of fulfilling a lifelong ambition and driving a JCB in the Eddleston Water to reopen a meander there, and it's through that route, through partnership between SEPA, local land managers and others, and the council to sort of deliver that kind of investment to reopen a meander, add in, I think it's just under a kilometre of length of river that's been added in, and that's with a view to achieving a multiple benefit in this case, obviously improving the quality of the river environment for fish and for biodiversity reasons, which is almost immediate in some senses, but it also slows down the rate of progress of water down a river system, and therefore protects properties further downstream, in this case the town of Peebles. So there are some real practical examples where this has been done, and we're trying to use measures in the SRDP, for example, going forward. Will take these kind of issues into account. So how many, if we're investing, say, in peatlands, will it have an impact on the river environment further downstream? Will it help to restore the habitat of a river? Will it help with flood management? Forestry planting, can we use our forestry planting more sensitively and proactively to try and help with flood management and river environments? Because one of the issues that came up in the Agriculture and Fisheries Act discussions was the impact of climate change on the health of our wild fishery, and clearly in many cases rivers have been completely stripped of trees, and that has helped to raise the river temperatures, which is threatening salmon, who really struggle when temperatures get above 25 degrees, heading to 30 degrees. It can actually kill the fish because they lack oxygen and therefore just physically cannot survive in that environment. So all of these things taken together, we'll try and use our funding as proactively as possible to help with the even landscape scale investments to improve the whole habitat of an area, in which it would have the benefit for river systems within there. And we've also got work we're doing on river basin management plans as well, to ensure that we take account of things like flood risks, diffuse pollution, progress on Water Framework Directive. So it's very much the kind of tip of the iceberg, but that £500,000 is matched by funding within SEPA, and then we'll use other funds that we have at our disposal to try and improve river habitats.
Very happy to see that you're actually using it to, pardon the expression, pump prime. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Minister, not to dwell too long on this, but can I just develop this slightly? Because obviously, when this kind of work is carried out, and you've kindly visited a project in my own constituency recently to see that, as you touched upon, there is improvement in the quality of the habitat. It improves the fish numbers, ultimately. Is there not a role, therefore, for the riparian owners on these rivers to hopefully contribute to these costs?
Yes, indeed. I mean, if we were using mechanisms like SRDP, and clearly there will be financial contributions from out with European and Scottish Government resource to to fund those. So, you know, you may be talking 50-50 split, and clearly it will be to the advantage of landowners such as those that are along the South Esk and the Rottle Burn that you refer to. And that was a very, you know, interesting visit to sort of see the kind of work they're doing there to restore meanders. Again, it's the sort of Dulnane up near the Spey, sort of similar work. So there's a lot of it going on. It's very much appreciated by the likes of Scottish Wildlife Trust, Woodland Trust, the kind of quality of the work that's being done there. It can have benefits for multiple species, whether it's fish, freshwater pearl mussel, other species that can benefit from these kind of investments. But also for the landowner, it has the benefit perhaps of improving the sporting performance of their estate, so they can get more income into the area from the point of view of a more productive fishery, and they can live within a higher catch, if you like, and within sustainable limits within their estate. So there's multiple benefits, many of which derive benefit for the landowner, but clearly they also have a wider kind of, using an economic term, externality. They benefit the wider community and indeed the environment.
Thank you. Moving on, Jim Hume.
Just following on quite neatly from that, last week we had a few stakeholders at committee, including the RSPB, as someone noted before, and also in the draft budget, your own draft budget, it states that we should make best use of available delivery mechanisms such as SRDP. You mentioned SRDP there. RSPB themselves thought that SRDP and CAP should not be used for flood management. That should come from a different budget. But you seem to be suggesting that, well, you said if SRDP was used, but would it be your intentions that SRDP or CAP will be used for flood management? Or?
Well, I think a good example, SRDP will be the vehicle for delivery of our peatland investment. I should say it was £5 million in next year and £10 million in the year after. The reason for doing that, one of the reasons for doing that, is to attract in match funding and lever in more money from other sources, whether it's landowners, HLF, other potential investors, including RSPB and other NGOs, for example, that we can effectively potentially double that amount of money. So you could, it might not be possible in the first year for technical reasons, but certainly in the second year, we'd hope by 15-16 that we would be levering in match funding. So we may get from a 15 million government investment a total maybe of 25 to 30 million pounds worth of investment in peatlands. So that's hence using SRDP as an effective means for us to get more bang for our buck in terms of attracting in funding. That's clearly going to have a benefit in terms of natural flood management as well. Similarly, we could have, I think, whether it's through the Forestry Commission's activities in terms of using SRDP as a vehicle for allocating funding for forestry projects, woodland planting projects, you would get, again, match funding coming in. But that, I would hope that, because although we feel confident we have enough money identified to meet our planting target in the draft budget, and I can explain why I think that, if that would be helpful, but we will be able to use that money in many cases, to look at projects, and it could be commercial species as well as native broadleaf species that could be planted in locations that will actually improve the level of flood risk for downstream agricultural land or indeed for communities. So I think we just need to be smart. We are living in times where funds are constrained, but I think we can use the money effectively to get multiple benefits where possible. And so the primary purpose of the application might be for forestry or for flood management, but it will have a benefit in biodiversity or flood management respectively.
Thank you, Minister. I know we'll come on to peatland and forestry, so I don't want to stray onto other people's questions, or you get hung in this committee for doing that. Usually when we're in private session. Usually when we're in private session. So I think you made it quite clear that it wouldn't be particularly SRDP and CAP going to specific flooding projects, but it may be part of peatlands and forestry, which I can come to if I just finish my point, if that's okay. You also mentioned Hoyk and the Hoyk Flood Group, which I know also do a very good job there, and there's also a flood project that has been explored, I believe, up the Teviot water regarding using agricultural land. I think there was initial problems because the project had went into some details but hadn't actually talked to any of the land users early doors, but I think that's been sorted now. And regarding your MSP office, if you do put your office in a place called the Sandbed, it's a little bit of a clue to that it might be a danger of flooding. But regarding natural flood management flooding itself, Scottish Land and Estates were concerned about how you would fund natural flood management. So it would be interesting how you think we can fund it, apart from it maybe being a side effect of forestry or peatland.
Well, indeed, I mean, SLE members may have a role in this on a wider front. We are looking, and I'll leave the peatland stuff for the moment, but we obviously are looking at, more generally in terms of our biodiversity strategy, larger landscape scale projects. And that will involve large landowners in many cases, government land, NGO land, and individual private farmers and landowners. So we will need a partnership approach to delivering these kind of projects. Now, in many cases, the kind of investment we make in supporting biodiversity and habitat restoration may also have benefits, such as the investments in Rottlburn and Dulnane catchment and also in respect of Eddleston Water, as 3 examples, may well also have the benefit of improving the level of flood risk of communities downstream, and indeed some of our prime agricultural land, which is obviously sometimes badly affected by flooding through not destruction of habitats, but man-made changes to habitats in the past, where you've got straightened rivers and canalised sections of waterways which are pushing water down at a very rapid rate downstream. So I think the more we can do to look at landscape scale projects, we will be involving SLE and others. That may involve funding from sources like the Heritage Lottery Fund, who are keen to invest in Scotland in those kind of projects. They've increased the value of projects that they can award and change the criteria of their awards, so they can work with private operators as well. So there are some potentially quite attractive opportunities, and indeed the renewables industry is also in many cases, partly through the planning system as in Borders, but also in other cases voluntarily using its investment to try and achieve benefits in terms of habitat restoration as well. So there's many non-government sources of funding we can look at, and I think we will evolve and tailor our solution as we go on.
Thank you. Minister Richard Lyle.
Minister, can I come on to climate change and RPP2? I note that 2010, 2000 and 2011 Scottish climate change targets have been missed, and we all know the reasons why, but we're still very disappointed that we have missed those targets. Have the missed targets been taken into account in developing the draft budget, and what action has been taken given budget constraints to get back onto track in delivering this most important Scotland's annual climate change target?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear it's probably one of the most important issues that I consider in my portfolio, and it's clearly, I think it's a strength of our legislative framework that we have such strong scrutiny of the budget, and that in itself helps me in my role, I suppose, because all government ministers are climate change ministers in that respect and are answerable for their investment. So it's been, I think, a healthy process. It has yielded, as I indicated when I lodged the final version of RPP2, that I had productive discussions with John Swinney in his role as Finance Secretary, and recognised the need to compensate, if you like, for the fact that we're getting slow action at an EU level, that we are unfortunately still vulnerable to fluctuations in weather. We've yet to see what impact the bad weather in 2012 had on our figures, but we will know in June next year. Certainly the UK figures indicated a deterioration in terms of carbon emissions in 2012 or the draft figures, so we wait to see what the final impact is at UK level. But if we follow their trend, then obviously it's not a particularly healthy position to be in. So the government has reflected on that kind of evidence, and well, hopefully I hope the committee has seen as the details of funding for climate change mitigation measures document, which is submitted to SPICE and I think was copied to the committee, and in that it sets out, whereas previously we had over a 3-year period about £1.1 billion worth of investment in low carbon measures. That's been increased in the current draft budget to £1.277 almost billion, so almost £1.3 billion. So there has been an increase in resource put in, and particularly in relation to rural land use. Obviously I was delighted to see the Finance Secretary recognise the need to convert some of our proposals to policies, as early as possible, and the peatlands investment is a good example of that. I'm not sure if anybody's wanting to pick up peatlands, but I'll come back to that. But certainly that's an example of us, I suppose, an early step in trying to convert a proposal to a policy. We know that we can, if the EU was to stick at 30%, we could, even if we just deployed our policies and not any of our proposals, we could achieve the 42% reduction we need by 2020. Clearly, with the EU not acting, we do need to implement our proposals to get there. So I welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance has delivered more money in this budget for a number of measures, including rural land use, obviously, but also an accelerated investment in terms of energy efficiency for homes. And I'm sure the Infrastructure Committee will be speaking to probably ministers on those subjects, and additional money for sustainable active travel, which might not go as far as some would like, but it's clearly a welcome, I think, investment in that direction.
Just a small point, if you allow me, Deputy Convener. In the budget, are you happy that you have to wait, nearly 2 years to know that you've either missed or met a target?
Well, I suppose it's the nature of accountability government. It was a bit of an irony on my part that I was standing up and defending the 2010 figures a year before I was elected. But that's such as the nature of the beast. We do rely on the Committee on Climate Change and others, ONS, to produce some of the data that they rely on. And there is a time, and then we have pressed the Committee on Climate Change to try and help us get more timely information where they can. I know they've taken that on board, but there is a frustration that we are not getting real-time information. We can have some estimates. I don't know whether Bob would want to comment on any of them, Bob Irvine, but we do try and sort of, if you like, have an estimate as to where things are going, and clearly in some indicators like renewable energy, it's a little bit quicker. We do have a better access to kind of the level of power that's being generated, and we can make an estimate as to what the share of our energy needs that are being met through renewables are. Obviously, that doesn't directly feed into the climate change figures, but it does give us an indication as to how dependent we were on fossil fuel generation in that year, and therefore the impact on the traded sector. So it's kind of a roundabout way of trying to say, well, how good or how bad were we in that particular time? But it is a frustration, you're absolutely right, and we'll keep pressing as much as we can for more timely information. But I don't know, would it be helpful if Bob Irvine would comment on the specifics?
That would be one thing on another occasion, but I think we want to focus, if that's okay, Mr Irvine, on the budget issue. Can I make it clear, we are going to come to peatlands in a moment. We will focus on that for a spell. But let's stick to this particular topic at the moment, and Claudia Beamish has a question.
Thank you. I think we would all agree, I hope, that we're all working on the RPP together, right through to the future. I was interested to find highlighted to me the Rural Affairs Committee recommendation in December 2011 about the RPP, and I just read it out because I think it's important to show that continuity in relation to this budget and future budgets, and indeed past ones. It says the committee urges the Scottish Government to ensure that all proposals and policies in the RPP and any future revisions of the RPP are fully funded in order to meet the targets set out in the Climate Change Act. And I think your letter was very helpful, and the mitigation table that was sent to us recently to identify and perhaps give confidence, certainly beyond this committee, but beyond the Parliament, about the issues that are being driven forward. But I think in terms of the budget, I mean, it's helpful that there's more for active travel, and that's been acknowledged by a wide range of groups. But I think that the range of issues that you highlight in your table do show how we can work towards modal shift, and that's encouraging. But what I'd like to ask you about is, particularly in terms of behaviour change in relation to the budget, whether in terms of transport, housing and land use, which I think you'd agree are perhaps the main issues apart from the consumption emissions, the degree to which there's any particular budget line that can help with this. I just heard this morning on the news that the whisky industry is moving its, which you may have heard, Minister, moving its freight or bottles or whatever we want to call them off-road onto rail, which will make a difference of 1 in 7 heavy freight journeys on the A9 in future. So I wonder if you can help us with behaviour change budget in relation to business and indeed communities.
Well, these are very important matters. I mean, I just set out at the start, so I recognise certainly the committee's previous comments about trying to demonstrate that the RPP2, or in this case, is fully funded. There are some specifics I could refer to in terms when it comes to the sustainable active travel investment, extra 10 million in each of the 2 years. My understanding is that the intention is that that would be match funded by local authorities. So in a similar way to the peatlands investment, that we would lever in more money from outside government and therefore ramp up, if you like, the level of investment that there is. When it comes to issues such as the transport, housing and land use that Claudia Beamish refers to, it's absolutely true. These are 3 of the key areas that we have to address. When it comes to transport, clearly I very much welcome the kind of initiative. I certainly haven't caught up with today's announcement, but I was aware that it was being talked of possibly happening a few weeks ago. And I think that is a tremendous initiative that the industry can take. It's I suppose the whisky industry traditionally has been seen as being a big emitter, and therefore any steps they can positively take to reduce their impact on emissions is to be welcomed. And indeed, they actively engage in many cases through groups like the 2020 Climate Group that we saw sort of yesterday at the Climate Justice event. So we do need to work with those kind of groups to work with on the behavioural aspects, understanding what it is that will trigger business to make those kind of investments. Clearly, corporate social responsibility is a driver. We have, in relation to issues like ETS and league tables in the past of emissions by different sites and operators, that kind of reputational drivers can also help. Consumers can play a role in influencing companies that they purchase from and saying that we want you to do more. Even if it's turning up the AGM if they've got a share and challenging directors to do it. Certainly within the public sector and the businesses, if I can call them that, within the public sector, such as SEPA, SNH, they do have, under the Climate Change Act, a public duty to address climate change, and they report annually on that basis. They may be perhaps going beyond what most businesses can do in terms of monitoring their emissions and reporting on them, but they can set a high benchmark in terms of looking at driving down emissions. And I was really pleased that one of the positive aspects of the draft budget is that government is reducing its emissions from about 7.3 megatons in the current year to 6.6. So we need to set an example and try to do that. It might not always be possible, but and I'm sure we may have bumps along the way, but we are trying to do what we can and demonstrate to businesses in the private sector this is how you go about doing it. So we can try and almost demonstrate there are techniques, whether it's the case of Aberdeenshire Council, which is obviously beyond government. I know they are doing important work in having distributed working centres in Aberdeenshire so people don't have to travel all the way into the corporate headquarters, and those kind of examples really do count. So the work the Carbon Trust can do with the work we can do through fora like Climate 2020 Climate Group can help drive that agenda forward. But transport, housing, land use, totally accept are 3 areas that we need to do as much as we possibly can. I'm pretty confident we are going in the right direction, but we'll obviously have to keep a watching brief and not be complacent about the direction of travel we're in.
So just very briefly, Minister, would it be possible to let the committee know, because it's quite hard to identify what budget lines are there in support of, I know there is the behaviour change strategy, but just specifically in terms of the budget for business, and which, again, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I should stress, I mean, it's actually in the table, it's kind of hidden under homes and communities. The CCF, for example, the Sustainable Action Fund is in there, and I believe with I just checked with Bob Irvin, convener, just the money we have for the work in respect of behavioural change, the 1.1 million, is that in that heading as well?
Yes, that's within the Sustainable Action Fund, but I think Ms Beamish is asking about other portfolio action, and we'll certainly try to help the committee as far as possible to identify certain things, but quite a lot of behavioural initiatives and actions are part of other activities, both national, local and by voluntary organisations, and I think that what we're trying to do is actually heighten the awareness that there are a vast range of behaviours that are critically important to achieving these targets, and they do, as you say, cover all these policy areas, and the development of all policy that is supported and identified in the RPP really should have a behavioural element. And I think the Minister is looking forward to engaging with the committee next month to explain some of this, but we'll try to present some information that will assist the committee before that.
I may well, Convener, just, I know we're coming on to peatland, so I may well bring in Bob McIntosh at that point, just in regards to what we're trying to do to influence land managers to get involved with schemes like peatland. So, because I think that is a relevant example of encouraging. We rely on behavioural change because it's not our land, it's their land, and we need to get them to come on board. But
I think that would be useful, Minister, and we obviously will have this forthcoming opportunity. Moving it along, earlier this month the Scottish Government announced a further £10.3 million for the Climate Challenge Fund, which I read as extending the fund for a further year, if I'm correct. But given that in the early stages of the Climate Challenge Fund there was a difficulty generating take-up, whilst I think we would all welcome that level of financial commitment, I think it was only £4 million taken up in the first year, if I'm right. Are you confident that the money will be deployed? And could you perhaps give us a flavour of what it will go on in 2014-15 and 2015-16?
Well, it's certainly true. Oh, thank you. I'm struggling to find the pages. It's certainly true that we did struggle. I mean, CCF is a demand-led scheme, and I think it had a number of years of success. It was generating its own sort of oxygen and publicity, the people coming forward, applying for grants without too much marketing push, if I can put it in those kind of crude terms. What we saw last year was there was a substantial kind of fall-off in demand, maybe because communities that had been aware of it had already done their project or were delivering their project, and therefore there was just a lack of new communities coming forward. And so in response to that, we had a refresh exercise last autumn, which was to kind of broaden the range of projects and that people could do, sort of deepen the level of engagement so that communities that maybe have a project already could do more. We also wanted to sort of bring in groups that perhaps have been underrepresented, BME community, ethnic minorities, those in the lower deprivation communities as identified by the SIMD as well. And we have had some good success with that, I think, in terms of the refresh exercise. There's another step that's been taken as well to try and make it easier for communities to identify viable projects, as we've created an ideas bank, which those who are proposers of projects can participate in. It might be local authorities, it might be NGOs and others who've got ideas about what kind of projects could be done in the area. It has to still be demand-led. So that's basically flagging up there are concepts that people could deploy, and that therefore the community can then look at the list of projects on the ideas bank and say, actually, I think that would apply in our area. So these are all important steps, but we had introduced the development grants for £750 to help those communities that maybe have capacity issues, and that includes sort of black and ethnic minority communities as well, in terms of the historic engagement. And there has been quite good take-up of those. The criteria was that it had to fall within the 15% in the Scottish Indicators of Multiple Deprivation, and the project may be made up of members of an ethnic minority or young people, and project community can demonstrate suffering from some form of other advantage or vulnerability, so it could be disability groups and other issues, and that has been quite successful. So I can kind of give you a wee bit of an update if that's helpful. I mean, of that, in that refresh, from January to September, Keep Scotland Beautiful awarded 54 development grants out of 64 applications. So that was about just under £40,000 worth of development grants. 25 applications from areas in the lowest 15% of SIMD. 12 applicants were from ethnic minority organisations, 8 from remote rural areas, 7 from youth groups and 2 from disability groups. So that we are seeing some early evidence that this is beginning to help broaden the range of communities that have been involved with CCF in the past, and hopefully that will have an impact. But the kind of projects we're delivering, some of it's sustainable active travel. There's some very successful cycling projects, sustainable active travel projects, grow your own projects. Energy efficiency is quite a common theme, whether it's village halls or people like eco-congregations are getting involved to try and make sure communities are aware of the energy efficiency opportunities there are. These are very practical things that help inform and change the behaviour at a community level.
Short supplementary from Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. Could I just ask, that's a helpful answer. It's pretty well answered the question I was going to ask, Minister. It's just in relation to ethnic minority groups, which you've given us the figures for in the development issues, and that's helpful. But ethnic minority groups, also other groups which are communities of interest, such as eco-congregations rather than geographical interests. I think you know where the question's going. That there were some difficulties that were highlighted to me from SEMVO, for instance, as one of the umbrella groups or ethnic minority groups, about the difficulty of not being able to apply because it wasn't say, Glasgow specifically. And I wonder if that has been or could be addressed.
Well, maybe, if I can, bring Bob Irvin on this point as well. But certainly, you're quite right, Ms Beamish. We're trying to look sympathetically at sort of communities of interest like eco-congregations, but tend in many cases obviously to coincide with geographic areas as well. It does become more challenging if people are sort of trying to find a community which goes beyond local authority boundaries or is in a different area. But certainly I would encourage any black or ethnic minority communities to whether they're in small concentrations or large concentrations like we have in Glasgow and other cities in Scotland, to consider bringing forward projects, because we're really keen to see them engage in this agenda, have every bit as much interest in climate change, and maybe in the past we've not engaged properly with them in providing information, maybe in languages and other routes to gauge their interest. But we had a very successful event last. I'm trying to remember what month it was. It was down at Victoria Quay, where we had many representatives of ethnic minority communities in to make them aware of Climate Challenge Fund, how it was relevant to them, and engage them in seeking advice from us as to how they can develop their projects. So they're not on their own. They don't have to do everything from scratch. And we are really keen to assist communities through Keep Scotland Beautiful to develop their projects and make sure they're as successful as possible in the application process. But I don't know whether Bob can comment on the definition of communities in that sense.
I'd certainly endorse the view that we have had really positive engagement with those representative groups, and I think that we were very encouraged by the response through the development grants, and see that as a springboard. The Climate Challenge Fund is still community-based, but through the Ideas Bank and some of the aspects of the refresh, it is now possible for other organisations to participate with communities and support them to develop and prepare and indeed implement the application. So that has actually softened, and I hope in a way that's helpful to these types of organisations, but doesn't dilute the real community emphasis and community ownership of what is actually delivered at the end of the day on the ground.
If I may just add very briefly, I know time's pressing, Commissioner, but just to pick up on the SEMVO issue, we have so far engaged with over 60 ethnic minority organisations in developing our CCF, hosted 5 events with 153 people attending, and attended another 3 events organised by CCF. And apparently we do at this point in time have 20 projects either funded with a full grant or a development grant from ethnic minority organisations. So there is some encouraging sign that they are beginning to engage in CCF.
Thank you. Moving on to peatlands, Minister. There's as we've already touched upon this subject earlier today, there's an allocated funding of £5 million for 2014-15. I think that rises to £10 million in 15-16. Is that correct? Even though that still falls some way short of the figure of 12 to 13 million, which has always been talked about as the annual spend that would be required to secure the kind of restoration and returns that we're looking for from peatlands. I'm also mindful, however, that we've always talked about, and we again today, about unlocking additional funding sources. So I wonder if you can explain what the funding levels that are contained in the budget would deliver, what you expect to pull down from other sources, and what these sources are, and what the total level of funding would be required to hit the targets from peatland restoration that have been talked about.
Well, if we can start with the last point, I mean, in the period up to 2027, the RPP2 sets out, broadly speaking, a whole economy cost of £230 million in peatland restoration investment up to 2027. So it's a very substantial increase on the kind of scale of investment we've made historically you know, with projects like Forest and Ard in the region, I think of about 2 million or thereabouts in terms of cost. So that gives you a sense of scale of the levelling up of investment. But as I say, it's a whole economy cost, and we have to make some sort of assumption about what the split of funding is between government and other partners. In the budget, you're quite correct, Convener, that we're allocating 5 million in the next financial year, but 10 million the year after. That we're proposing to do through SRDP. Now, if that is done through SRDP and it's possible to draw in sort of co-financing and other measures, we will hopefully be able to double up that to up to 30 million over that 2-year period. So it'll be a dramatic increase in the scale of investment going into peatland restoration in quite a short period of time. The RPP2 has, I think, in terms of the initial budget, around about 13 million from memory. I need to maybe check in the document. I think it was about 13 million in the first year we had in the RPP2. So clearly the 5 million isn't going the full way. But to pick up Ms Beamish's point and your own, Convener, we're looking at drawing in match funding to raise it up to towards that sort of level. And if I could, as I indicated, maybe bring Bob McIntosh in this point, just to sort of describe how that might work in practice, how we might actually attract in and get land managers to engage.
Yes, as the Minister said, we're at the early stage of a very long-term programme to deliver up to 500,000 tonnes CO2 equivalent abatement by 2027, so it is a long-term programme. We're just at the beginning of that programme now. And we made a small start this year, but the additional funding granted in the budget, which we think we can double up with EU co-financing, will allow us to make really significant progress over the next couple of years. And that'll be done through grant-aiding land managers. And essentially it's about re-wetting drained peatlands, which is where we get the gain. And the initial indications through the small start we made this year is that there's a lot of interest from the land management sector in this issue, and a lot of interest in knowing how they can apply for this funding. So we're reasonably hopeful at this stage that we'll get a good response.
Can I just interject there, either Dr McIntosh or yourself, Minister, just to be clear, what criteria will be weighed down for accessing this funding? For example, will we look to tackle the most damaged peatland or the least damaged peatland? What will be the priority, or will it be a mix of both?
Going back to the discussion we had earlier, I think we'll be looking to get as many benefits as we can from each pound spent. So there will be projects which are just delivering carbon reduction. There'll be other projects which will deliver carbon reduction and perhaps flood defence mitigation and perhaps botanical and ornithological benefits as well. So I think we'd want to score each project against these different criteria and try and get, as many benefits for each pound spent.
That's useful. Thank you for that. Jamie McGregor.
Thanks very much. With regard to the peatland projects, how will land managers, crofters and farmers, access these funds, and will the schemes be accessible and very simple?
Clearly, if we're going through SRDP, the main route, I would have to recognise the current SRDP is not the easiest programme to navigate and to access. So I take on board entirely the implied message there that we need to have a simpler method to allocate funding. We are trying to make it easier in terms of our approach to developing the SRDP, to make it an easier process for the applicant. We will have broadly similar sort of priorities to the previous scheme, I think I'm correct in saying, but we will try and have a more targeted approach to how we allocate funding, so it will be clearer about the kind of strength of projects we're looking for and the kind of things people can do to have a stronger application in terms of the kind of multiple benefits I was referring to earlier on, so people are able to assess that. But maybe, I know Bob McIntosh is quite close to the discussions about SRDP. I think maybe ask Bob just to explain the general principles of how we'll go about trying to make that process easier for you to understand.
Yes, we're still just at the end of the last rural development programme and just beginning to design the next one, and still waiting for some of the regulations to come through from the European Commission, which will help us to, enable us to finalise things. So I think all we can say at this stage is that we are looking to have better targeting of the funds in the next rural development programme, and we are very hopeful that we can make the whole process less clunky and bureaucratic in terms of the experience of applicants. There's no question about that. So that work is ongoing now, but it's going to be another 12 months probably before the new scheme is pretty well designed and ready to roll out.
And so far as you're concerned in the Forestry Commission, does this refer to peatland that is above the planting level?
Well, it'll refer to peatland anywhere, really, which has been degraded. When we come to peatlands which have got trees on them, it's quite a difficult issue because the peatland has been drained to put the trees on it, and therefore it's now emitting. But on the other hand, the trees are absorbing. So there's a fine balance to be got there, and the science is not exactly precise in this area. So it's much more straightforward when it's peatland with no trees on it, which has been drained. We know what we're doing there. Peatland with trees on, it's going to take a little bit of working through to be sure we're getting the right solution.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Can I just develop very slightly and very briefly? You touched upon there is trying to develop the science on this. What investments being made in research, Scotland-specific research, if any? Because there is research available for the north of England, but the two aren't necessarily compatible.
We direct that to Paul McIntosh, is that?
Yes, we're trying to increase the amount of funding that goes into that. I don't know if you come across Climate Exchange, which is a really useful body which tries to bring together the research effort that's going on and make it easy to access. And so through the funding we're putting into the research institutes, we are trying to up the ante a bit in this whole area, because the science is not precise and we could do with some more information.
Okay, that's good to know. We'll move on now to forestry, and Jeremy McGregor's going to lead on that.
Thank you very much. Concerns have been expressed in the forestry sector that the budget for the Forestry Commission, planting budget, may be affected by the gap in the EU funds caused by the delays to the CAP reform agreement. That would mean that the 19.8 million of EU funds, which forms part of the 36 million available for tree planting, might be reduced. Now, on top of that, from the private sector, Digby Guy of HS tells me that according to newly published forestry statistics, we're actually only replacing 33% of the area of productive forest harvested annually, and therefore, in terms of climate change, we're going backwards. And there is a general concern that not enough planting is being done in Scotland compared to what used to be, and that there's going to be a huge gap when it comes to harvesting trees in the future, and that this is being built up. So in the light of that, sorry, I beg your pardon. In the light of that, can you tell me whether the 36 million, if available, is sufficient to support the new planting required to meet all the targets in the future, and also whether that 36 million provided in the draft budget for woodland grants will be able to draw down the predicted 19.8 million of EU funding set out in the draft budget, given the transition in relevant EU funds.
Well, on the two questions posed there, yes and yes. We keep it simple. Just to put it in context, in the last 2 years, although we were, obviously we didn't manage to hit the 10,000 hectares that would have been nice to keep pace. We've got a target to have 100,000 hectares planted by 2022, as I'm sure Jamie McGregor knows. And ideally, we'd be doing 10,000 per year to achieve that. We had a particularly cold spring this year, which meant we only achieved 7,000, but we do have confidence we can catch up. In the two most recent years for which we got data, was a total of about £66 million was committed to forestry planting, and that delivered an average of 8,000 per annum. I think 16,000, but yeah, total 8,000 per annum over those 2 years. And so, broadly speaking, the amount of money, 36 million that we've identified, we believe is sufficient to deliver on the expected planting rate this year and next year. In terms of the co-financing, we have checked, and we do believe we have access to that co-financing in both the next year and the year after. So we should have the full 36 million that we can commit. On the point about whether the productive forests are being planted at sufficient rate to compensate for those that are being felled, it's true to say that, I mean, if you look at the RPP2 figures and the announcements in terms of meeting our targets last year, we have a shrinking carbon sink in the sense the forestry is still reducing. That's a side effect of historic planting rates, which were too low, and we're trying to address them now. Obviously, it takes, for commercial species, maybe 8 to 10 years for a Sitka spruce, for example, to be at its peak sequestration rate in terms of absorbing CO2. So trees we're planting now hopefully will have the impact of reversing some of this decline in the value of Scotland's carbon sink in about 8 to 10 years' time, or at least to be the peak impact at that point. So it's really important that we do plant productive species and other native broadleaf species as well. And that's why in discussions with CONFOR and others, we've reached the conclusion that we can broadly maintain the amount of recent planting we've had in broadleaf and increase, if we're increasing to 10,000 hectares per annum, achieve about a 60-40 split in favour of commercial softwood versus native broadleaf species. It's not a hard target as such, but it's a guideline.
Yes, okay, thank you, Minister, for that. According to CONFOR, in 2011-12, only 3,300 acres of conifers were actually planted. And they also make the point that while birch and rowan may look very nice, in terms of carbon capture, they're not very competitive with conifers, and also they don't do much for the sawmills either. So what's your answer to that?
Well, I mean, as recognised, we've had productive discussions with CONFOR and indeed with individual commercial businesses in relation to the appropriate balance of forestry planting. And we recognise there is an issue in terms of recent history having a very low rate of planting for commercial species. So taking that into regard, looking at forward projections of wood availability for processing, for biomass, for fibreboard manufacturers and others, we recognise we need to do more to improve that performance. I'm keen to do that in a way that doesn't see a substantial decrease in broadleaf planting as well, which is very important, as I'm sure Jamie McGregor knows, for biodiversity reasons and to fulfilling our biodiversity strategy, to tackle woodland birds, for example, one of the terrestrial bird indicators. So we have to keep that balance right. So we think an appropriate mix might be in the region of 60-40. So we've still got roughly 4,000 hectares or thereabouts. It will vary from one year to the next of native broadleaf planting, but we can achieve a figure nearer to 6,000 hectares of commercial forestry planting per annum. So that's one of the outcomes of the discussion we've had with CONFOR and others involved with the forestry sector. We recognise the importance of the issue.
Okay,
thank you. Roderick Campbell, followed by Claudia Beamish.
Yes, morning, Minister. The EU's, I think, in the early stages of developing a new forestry strategy. Have you given any consideration to that in terms of the budget proposals?
Yeah, well, I'll maybe ask Bob McIntosh. He would probably give you a more accurate answer, Mr. Campbell, if that's appropriate.
Yeah, it's worth saying the EU doesn't have competence in forestry policy. It's a domestic issue. So the EU forestry strategy is a guide. There'll be nothing in that strategy which isn't reflected in our own domestic forestry policies. So I don't envisage there'll be any impact on the budget because most of the principles which will be in that strategy are already enshrined in our own domestic forestry policy and therefore reflected in the budget already.
Briefly, just before I go to Claudia Beamish, can I just ask, how does Scotland compare on tree planting levels with the rest of the UK currently?
We can give you sort of accurate figures, and by way of correspondence, if that would be helpful. But broadly speaking, in I think 2011-12, it was about 3 times the level of planting that was taking place in the UK. So Scotland has a very high share of UK forestry activity. And I suppose it's only natural that we'd have a higher planting rate, but it's roughly 3 times the planting rate that was being deployed in England and Wales at the same time. So I don't know if is that accurate, Bob?
That's about right, yeah.
Yeah, that's useful. Thank you. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you. Could I just this wasn't my question, but on the point of what you've just raised in relation to the timber industry, could I just seek some reassurance about your perspective on large and small-scale biomass, and perhaps some reassurance that small-scale biomass, without wanting to put words in your mouth, Minister, might be the way forward? And then I've got a quick question in relation to forestry.
Well, in relation to biomass, it's obviously Fergus Ewing's the lead minister in relation to this, so I refer you to him for the detail. But the important point is that Fergus Ewing has taken an approach to looking at the availability of wood supply that there was. We've had detailed discussions with Mr Ewing about forward projections of demand on wood, and also the supply of wood that could be not only harvested but actually would be usable as well. I mean, there's an issue about some wood biologically being possible to harvest but physically impossible to extract. So we need to have a realistic discussion about the supply of wood. But the policy we've evolved is such that we're trying to encourage combined heat and power, and also to have relatively small. There are obviously a number of larger projects, but in general speaking, to look at local scale projects where that's appropriate. But I don't know, Bob McIntosh might be able to add to that in terms of the implications for our forestry.
Yes, Scotland has taken a different approach from the rest of the UK in trying to cut back on the incentives for large-scale biomass and try to incentivise, as the Minister said, small-scale biomass and combined heat and power against the possibility that large-scale biomass could divert material away from our traditional sawmills and other wood-using industries in Scotland.
That's helpful. And my question was actually something that's been drawn to my attention by a group in South Scotland about agroforestry, or I think it's silvopastoral. I think silvo means wood in Latin, but I'm not sure about that. And it does seem like a very interesting model that I'm only just beginning to know something about, and I wonder the degree to which within the budget that is actually going to be a possibility, because what's been highlighted to me is that the mix of woodland and grazing will enable a lot of the issues we've been talking about today, like the flood prevention because of the planting of trees, and help to farmland birds, which you've mentioned yourself, Minister, and biodiversity, and also possibly coppicing one's own wood on a smaller scale. So it's quite an interesting model that I'd like to highlight, and wonder whether within the budget there's any provision for it.
I'll maybe come back on the specific issue about whether there's any funding in the budget and the Forestry Commission to look at that activity. It's not one that's been flagged up to me, but certainly in the principle, I suppose it's very important, because I am aware of at least one constituency case I had to deal with as a minister, where someone had invested in a silvo kind of agricultural kind of practice. They were growing wood for coppicing, for biomass, and they had unfortunately, I think, planted maybe the right species for a different part of the country, but the land had not been as productive. The forestry, I know Bob McIntosh is familiar with the case, I think, there hadn't been as productive an opportunity as the land manager had hoped. And so therefore, I suppose it's important to take in the context of land use strategy, looking at the quality of land that's available and making sure it's the appropriate species is planted in the appropriate location, which obviously will have biodiversity benefits too, but that you're very sensitive to the fact that these are long-term investments that people are making. Even with coppicing, it's still a long-term investment, and therefore we have to get the project right for the location, and obviously the market will be a big determinant, the price of product for the product that they're going to produce. So it is something that people have to enter into with the blindfolds off and be absolutely clear that there are potential upsides and potentially good revenue opportunities, but they need to be very careful also that they don't expose themselves to risk. But I don't know, Bob McIntosh may be able to comment, Camilla, just briefly on that concept.
Yes, I mean, it's an attractive proposition that we could mix trees and particularly livestock grazing on the same piece of ground by perhaps having wide-spaced trees where the livestock can continue to graze within. And it's something that's quite popular in other European countries. There are some trials of it in Scotland. I think I'm right in saying in the last SRDP we did actually make provision for grant aid for this activity. What we've failed to do so far totally is to excite any landowners to want to do it.
I know that there is some money in Whitmere Farm near maybe the one you're referring to, where there is some evidence that by planting they're able to create a kind of microclimate between the trees to actually improve productivity on the farm and compensate for the fact it's a in otherwise you know, a relatively cold location and lacking sort of natural warmth through sunlight. So they've been able to sort of create, you know, conditions. So certainly happy to look at that, and we can have further discussions about that one.
Jimmy McGregor.
That Dr. McIntosh has raised. While I can see that grazing animals such as sheep and possibly even cattle amongst mature trees might be fine, but wherever you've got young plantations, the possibility is that they might get eaten, as they do indeed by the deer, which also exist in your plantations. So I mean, unless you fence off these young plantations, it's going to be impossible to allow animals to graze, surely.
Well, that's one of the issues to do with it. If you plant wide-spaced trees within a pasture, they have to be individually protected until they're old enough not to be damaged by the stock, which means that it can be quite expensive and quite management intensive to do this, which is probably why we haven't excited many landowners to do it so far.
In the Forestry Commission premises, you know, who are landowners, I mean, are you trying to advertise this? If so, where is it being advertised?
The best example is on the James Hutton farm in North East Scotland, where they've been running a trial on proper agroforestry for, I think, the best part of 20 years. It's one of the best examples in Scotland, and they have a lot of data on what it's meant for livestock production, grass production, and the costs of trying to manage trees in that situation.
Thank you. We focus back on the budget if we can. Roderick Campbell.
Minister, the draft budget for 2014-15 includes an additional £1 million of additional funding for tree health issues. I'm not sure whether it's intended to continue that into 2015 and 16. Perhaps you could comment, but is it sufficient in any event?
Yeah, it's one of the features, I suppose, we encounter with the presentation of budgets. It's not necessarily telling the full story. There has been an additional £1 million. You're quite right, Mr. Campbell. That's been allocated specifically for plant health, tree health sort of issues. We're also looking to make use of, in each of the next 2 years, a further £2 million of Forestry Commission budgets. There has been a judgment taken that Forest Enterprise did not need as much money, so there has been a transfer from Forest Enterprise to Forestry Commission, and that money will top up the £1 million that you refer to, so we should have a total of £6 million over the 2 years. That is in line with what we believe may be necessary, sadly, because of the, as I'm sure members know, the significant outbreak of Phytophthora ramorum and other key tree diseases that we face at this time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to qualities, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you. Minister, we made after discussion in the committee, we agreed that our focus for equality issues would be disability in rural areas this year, not to the exclusion of the other 8 protected characteristics. And I do believe that the equality statement is a very strong document in terms of focusing minds on taking things forward. You mentioned collective action in Cabinet in relation to other issues, I think to do with climate change earlier on in your opening remarks. And I wonder the degree to which you work with colleagues across portfolios on equalities issues, such as disability in rural areas. And we've been thinking particularly about housing, transport and education.
Well, probably if there is a kind of cross-portfolio linkage, it's most likely to be in transport, where we have had discussions about issues like active travel. Clearly, I'm also involved with the Health Inequalities Working Group, and as I indicated an example earlier on at Larbert, it's just one example of many that we would look to see happen, where people who, for health reasons, can access National Forest estate and other forest assets can do so. For health benefits, we need to ensure those paths are designed in such a way as they are useful for people who are wheelchair bound, other disabilities. So we try and do what we can in those examples. The national parks, are certainly very proactive and whenever they're designing measures, visitors to facilities, trails and investments, to try and look where they can do so to make them as accessible as possible. So those are really important issues, but it's not an issue at this stage, but I will certainly take forward from the discussion. I know it was raised in the last budget discussion last year by yourself as well, Ms Beamish. Try and take forward that theme whenever I'm engaging with ministers. But certainly when it comes to equalities issue more generally, clearly in the rural affairs portfolio there's a rural dimension to equalities as well, and making sure that people have access to the kind of services in rural areas that they would be taking for granted perhaps in an urban context if they have disabilities, health issues, educational disadvantages and so forth. So it's a very important theme to what we have to do, and I will take forward that I need to perhaps do more on that myself. But certainly when it comes to transport, looking at active travel, transport investment, that it does come up in those kind of discussions about accessibility, making sure that in a rural context, for example, people have access to similar sort of transport services to get to health facilities, to get to educational opportunities that they would take for granted elsewhere.
I think that's helpful. It would be perhaps useful to the committee if we could hear in the future from you about, possibly in writing, about within the rural affairs budget and in the crossover, actually what initiatives are able to be accessed through the budgets, because it's a little bit opaque, and I'm trying to draw that out.
I fully accept. I mean, I support the principle that we need to mainstream these kind of discussions. So I think it's an important point, and I suppose I'm admitting culpability. That maybe it's just been the nature of the pressures that have been on my portfolio in the last year. It's mainly been about areas like about climate change, but I will take forward those discussions, any bilaterals I have with my fellow ministers.
I appreciate that. I think it's for us all to be working on it, so I'm not trying to sort of point any fingers. I'm certainly not doing that.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Jane Baxter.
Thank you. Minister, just following on briefly from Claudia's question, I am the Community Transport Rapporteur for this committee, and there's a debate on community transport in the first week back after recess. And obviously community transport plays a very important role in rural communities, so it might be useful to look at how we can support that through the budget. But that's not my question, that's just a point of information. My question is about specifically about equality groups and their access to outdoors. Might be people with disabilities, but it could be people from black and minority ethnic communities, or people who just don't have any money to be able to travel to those places. So I think you touched on it earlier today, but just for the record, maybe say a wee bit about the types of initiatives and programmes that are underway to target equality groups and how they're monitored, how those programmes are monitored.
Well, I mean, clearly we alluded to CCF, so I won't go over that ground, but that's clearly an area where we're specifically conscious of the need to do more, and thankfully it seems to be having fruit. When it comes to national parks and indeed, I suppose, the wider national forest estate, there are good projects that have been put in place, and clearly we are investing, whether it's through sort of conventional capital funding or bringing in additional the so-called shovel-ready sort of investments, trying to ensure that they're well designed so they can take into account the needs of full range of users that might need to access them. I referred earlier on, I think, a very important initiative, Woodlands in and around towns, which it's not just in hospital estates, it's around urban areas, and it could be anywhere, and particularly in areas like central Scotland, where we've had historically a degradation of the environment, a loss of tree cover, and indeed damage to ecosystems because of industrialisation. And we are seeing through Central Scotland Green Network and other very important initiatives. It's obviously a national project in terms of the national planning framework. It's a very important feature of our public policy that we continue to invest in that network. I've seen some tremendous examples in places like Castlemilk, and Grangemouth, places where you wouldn't expect to see, the kind of projects that are there, and they've been very well designed with very level paths and a great focus on trying to make sure they're as accessible as possible. So I think it's happening, thankfully. We need to I take on board the point. Maybe it's useful to get some monitoring information about to what extent all projects are complying with those kind of considerations. But anecdotally, the ones I've seen all seem to have taken that into account, and it's a great feature of when we're taking around, there are people actually on site with us who during these visits who have disabilities or learning disabilities, and are being active users of them.
Thank you. I myself have in the past been a volunteer with the Disabled Ramblers group, and I've seen the benefits that come from people being able to just on their scooters get out and about. And in Fife we have around Loch Hoare, you can now go all the way around Loch Hoare. That was a bit controversial because it involved laying a tarmac path, which not everyone was very happy about, but the evidence is there for all to see. Every time you go to Loch Hoare Meadows now, there are people on scooters or with buggies, there are families spending time walking around that loch. So I think it's really important for all sorts of communities, so I would very much support you in that. The Equality Statement highlighted a case from the Galloway Forest Park, and I wondered if you wanted to say a wee bit about the successes and lessons that can be learned from that, but if you feel you've covered it already, then please feel free to.
Well, I would just I certainly welcome your interest in this area, and now I know that you have expertise. I may well borrow that expertise at some point. I do think it is really important, and even it's not just government. I've seen some very welcome investments by NGOs when they have assets. I think at Loch Leven and the RSPB Reserve they have taken a similar approach, and it's quite controversial for NGOs to sort of, particularly environmental ones, to consider putting in sort of permanent path surfaces like that. But it is, I think, very important that we do what we can to at least provide some opportunities for people to have accessible sites. So I very much welcome that particular one myself, and I will look at the Loch Hoare one as well. I think in terms of Galloway, I know a similar approach has been taken. I think probably Bob will be closer to it, but you'll all be familiar with the detail, I'm assuming. But certainly welcome investment where we can, and I will encourage national, in terms of the Forestry Commission, who are already doing good things, but the national parks and others to continue to do that work and take that on board.
Well, I think that's been a useful and very informative session. Can I thank the Minister and your officials for coming along today. If there are points that you feel you wish to expand upon or have been stimulated to expand upon by today's session, please do write to the committee and we look forward to that. Can I wish everyone a restful recess? We look forward to the committee resuming its work. Our next meeting is on Wednesday the 30th of October, when we will hear from stakeholders on climate change adaptation and consider petition PE 1441 on flood insurance problems. Two subjects close to your heart, Minister. I close the meeting. Thank you.